Spring, 1944. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The library room smells of pine wood and old paper. Sunlight cuts through the window in sharp angles, illuminating dust suspended in the air. A young woman stands before a wooden shelf, her fingers hovering over the spines of books she has never been allowed to touch. Her name is Ilsa. She is 23. She wears a faded grey uniform with no insignia. Her hands are calloused from signal work in North Africa, from the months before capture, before the transport ship, before this place that looks nothing like the hell she was promised. The guard at the door, an American corporal with a bored expression, does not move. He does not stop her. She pulls a book from the shelf. The cover is soft, worn. All Quiet on the Western Front. Remark, banned, burned in Berlin, 1933. She has heard the title whispered like contraband. Her hands tremble. The guard glances over. She freezes. He nods once, almost imperceptibly, and returns his gaze to the window. She opens the book. The first page is in English, but she understands enough to know this is not propaganda, enough to feel the ground shift beneath her feet. The women who became prisoners of war were ghosts in the official record. History remembers the men, the U-boat crews, the Afrika Corps, the Luftwaffe pilots who filled American POW camps by the tens of thousands. But the women existed too, in smaller numbers, captured in circumstances the war planners never anticipated. They were Wehrmacht auxiliaries, Nachrichtenfelfen, communications helpers, Blitzmittel, lightning girls. They operated radios, decoded signals, plotted aircraft movements, managed supply logistics. The German military had mobilized them as the Eastern Front devoured manpower. They wore uniforms. They served in war zones. And when the Afrika Corps collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943, some of them were swept up in the mass surrender. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers, and among them a handful of women. The United States had not prepared for this. The Geneva Convention outlined treatment for male combatants. It said nothing specific about women who wore the uniform but did not carry rifles. The War Department classified them as prisoners of war anyway, and shipped them across the Atlantic with the men, segregated but present. Anomalies in a system built for soldiers. They arrived at camps scattered across the American interior. Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Crossville in Tennessee, facilities converted from civilian conservation corps barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but located in landscapes so peaceful they seemed impossible. Rolling hills, farmland, towns where church bells rang on Sunday mornings. These women had been told stories. Propaganda films in Berlin had shown American brutality, prisoners tortured, starved, worked to death. They expected violence. They expected humiliation. What they found instead was something far more unsettling: order, adequacy, and a strange, deliberate respect. They were fed. They were housed. They were given medical care. And then, within months of arrival, they were given access to books. Not just any books. Any books. The camp libraries were small but stocked with titles pulled from public donations, Red Cross shipments, and military surplus. There were American novels, British poetry, philosophy, history. Newspapers arrived weekly, uncensored. The shelves contained works banned across the Reich, Jewish authors, communist manifestos, pacifist literature, and the guards did not stop them from reading, for women raised under a regime that burned 25,000 books in a single night. This was incomprehensible. The United States did not offer this freedom out of kindness alone. It was strategy. The War Department had studied the failures of the First World War, when bitter, resentful prisoners returned home and fed the rage that birthed the next conflict. This time, they would try something different. This time, they would attempt re-education, not through force, but through exposure. The program was called the Intellectual Diversion Program. It operated quietly, without fanfare, embedded within the broader POW system. The goal was not to break the prisoners, but to introduce them to ideas their governments had suppressed, to let them see, with their own eyes, that democratic society did not collapse into chaos, That free thought did not destroy order, that the lies they had been told were just that, lies. Books were the weapon of choice, inexpensive, scalable, non-coercive. A prisoner could refuse a lecture, but a book left on a shelf exerted a gravitational pull. Curiosity did the rest. The women were ideal candidates for this experiment. Many had been educated before the war, middle-class families, secretarial schools, some even university coursework before the regime closed those doors. They could read, they could think, and unlike the hardened soldiers in the men's camps, many of them had seen the war's brutality up close without the numbing effect of direct combat. They had transmitted the casualty lists. They had plotted the retreats. They knew the Reich was losing. The library shelves became test sites for a hypothesis that freedom of information could dissolve ideology more effectively than any interrogation. Some of the women approached the books with suspicion. They assumed it was a trap, that reading the wrong title would mean punishment, that the guards were watching to see who took the bait. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. No one was punished. No one was questioned. The books simply sat there, patient and available. Others devoured them immediately. They read in the daylight hours between work assignments. They read in the evenings by lamplight. They traded volumes among themselves, whispered recommendations, debated interpretations in quiet corners of the barracks. Some kept journals, forbidden under camp rules, but tolerated by guards who understood that writing was part of the process. And slowly, the dissonance began. The stories they had been told about the West, the decadence, the weakness, the moral bankruptcy, did not match what they read. American literature was not mindless. It was searching, self-critical, even brutal in its honesty. Steinbeck wrote about poverty. Hemingway wrote about disillusionment. They wrote about their own nation's failures without being silenced. This was the most subversive idea of all, that a society could survive its own criticism, that strength did not require the suppression of doubt. The women did not speak of this openly, but in the way they carried themselves, in the questions they began to ask during camp educational sessions, in the letters they sent home that hinted at something shifting inside them. The change was visible. The American authorities watched. They took notes. They documented which books circulated most. They refined the program, and they waited to see if trust could win what bombs alone could not. They had grown up watching the flames. May 10, 1933, Berlin's open Platz. Torchlight processions led by students in brown shirts, carrying armloads of books to the pyre. Joseph Goebbels stood at the podium and declared the end of an era, the death of Jewish intellectualism, Marxist poison, degenerate art. 25,000 books burned that night across Germany. The crowd cheered. Ilsa had been 12 years old. She remembered the smell of burning paper drifting through her neighborhood. She remembered her teacher explaining that these books were dangerous, that they weakened the German spirit, that a strong nation required a pure culture. She had believed it. Why wouldn't she? Everyone she trusted had said the same thing. By the time she joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries in 1942, the list of banned authors had grown to thousands. Remarque, Freud, Einstein, Hemingway, London, Mon, Heine. The libraries of her youth had been scrubbed clean. What remained was safe, sanctioned, suffused with ideology. She had learned not to ask what was missing. Now, in a prisoner of war camp in Tennessee, she stood before a shelf containing every forbidden's name. The irony was not lost on her. She had been captured by the enemy, transported across an ocean, locked behind barbed wire, and given access to more intellectual freedom than she had ever known in the Reich. The books that had been condemned as threats to German civilization sat casually on wooden shelves, available to anyone who reached for them. She pulled down a copy of Heinrich Heine's poetry, Jewish, banned. His works had been among the first to burn. She remembered the famous quote, often whispered in dark humor, "Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people," also, written a century before the camps, before the crematoriums, before the war that had consumed Europe. She read the first poem in the dim light of the barracks. The German words felt like contraband in her mouth. Freedom, it turned out, was not loud. It did not announce itself with fanfare or force. It arrived quietly, in the form of a simple question the guards never asked. What do you want to read? For women raised under totalitarianism, choice itself was a foreign concept. In the Reich, culture had been prescribed. The radio played approved music. The newspapers printed approved news. The bookstores sold approved literature. Even private life was curated by the state. What to think, what to believe, what to hope for. Choosing for oneself had been an act reserved for the trivial. Which dress to wear, which route to walk. Everything else had been decided. Now, standing in front of the camp library, that calculus had reversed. No one told them what to read. No one guided their selection. No one monitored their choices. The absence of control was disorienting. Some women froze. They returned to the barracks without taking anything, paralyzed by the weight of decision. Others picked books at random, testing whether punishment would follow. When it didn't, they returned for more. The act of choosing became its own education. It required them to ask questions they had not been allowed to ask. What am I interested in? What do I want to know? What have I been denied? One woman, a former logistics officer named Greta, selected a history of the Weimar Republic. She had been taught that Weimar was chaos, moral decay, economic collapse, weakness that invited the necessity of National Socialism. The book told a different story. It described a vibrant, fragile democracy crushed not by its own failures, but by coordinated sabotage, political violence, and the deliberate exploitation of crisis. She read it twice. Then she read it again. Another woman, barely 20, picked up The Grapes of Wrath. She had heard Americans were soft, that their literature reflected weakness. Instead, she found a brutal, unflinching portrait of suffering and resilience. Steinbeck did not glorify his country. He dissected it, and he had not been silenced for doing so. This was the silent rebellion, not defiance, but the slow, private reassembly of one's own mind. Each choice was a brick removed from the wall they had lived behind. Each book was a glimpse beyond it, and the guards, leaning against doorways with rifles slung over their shoulders, said nothing. They simply watched and waited, and let the women decide for themselves what came next. The policy was not without controversy. In Washington, military officials debated the risks. Allowing enemy prisoners unrestricted access to information seemed, to some, dangerously naive. What if they used the knowledge against their captors? What if they absorbed democratic ideas only to twist them into weapons once repatriated? What if exposure to free thought simply hardened their resolve, convincing them that the West's openness was weakness to be exploited? But the architects of the intellectual diversion program argued otherwise. They pointed to history. They pointed to research. Coercion bred resentment. Suppression bred martyrdom. The only way to truly change minds was to allow those minds to change themselves. The head of the program, a colonel named Edward Davison, himself a poet before the war, wrote in a classified memo, "We will not defeat National Socialism by becoming its mirror image. If we lock ideas away, we prove their propaganda correct. If we trust our prisoners with the truth, we demonstrate that our system has nothing to fear from scrutiny." It was a gamble built on a paradox, that control could be relinquished in order to be gained, that the best way to win loyalty was to stop demanding it. The women in the camps became case studies in this experiment. Unlike male soldiers, many of whom clung to military discipline and hierarchy, even in captivity, the women had fewer structures to fall back on. They had not been frontline combatants. They had not taken oaths of blood and honor. They had been clerks, operators, assistants, essential but auxiliary. Their identities were less fused with the war machine. This made them more vulnerable to doubt, and doubt, carefully nurtured, could become transformation. The camp commanders implemented the program with deliberate subtlety. The libraries were stocked, but never advertised. Guards were instructed to remain passive, present but not intrusive. Educational sessions were offered, not mandated. Prisoners could attend lectures on American history, English language, democratic principles, or they could ignore them entirely. The choice was always theirs. Some American guards struggled with this approach. They had lost brothers, friends, comrades to the German war machine. The idea of treating these women, auxiliaries to that machine, with gentleness felt like betrayal. But orders were orders, and the guards complied, even when it grated against their grief. Over time, reports began filtering back to Washington. Behavioral changes, increased cooperation, reduced hostility, and most telling, voluntary participation in re-education programs that, in the early months, had been almost universally boycotted. The books were working. Not all of them read openly. Some carried books back to the barracks and hid them under mattresses, reading by flashlight after the others had fallen asleep. It was not fear of the guards that drove this secrecy. It was fear of each other. The camps held a mix of ideologies. Some women remained fervent believers, convinced that Germany's defeat was temporary, that the Führer would unleash secret weapons, that history would vindicate the Reich. These women watched the others with suspicion. They reported names to informal hierarchies that persisted even in captivity. They whispered about traitors and collaborators. To be seen reading the wrong book was to invite judgment. So the quiet ones developed strategies. They borrowed innocuous titles as cover, American detective novels, romance stories, anything apolitical. Then, beneath those safe choices, they smuggled the volumes that mattered: philosophy, history, political theory. One woman, Marguerite, discovered George Orwell. She read Animal Farm in English, painstakingly translating passages with a smuggled dictionary. The allegory was transparent. The pigs in the story wore different uniforms, but the mechanism of control was identical to what she had known. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. She recognized the doublethink, the rewriting of history, the cult of personality. She had lived inside that story. She had believed it was noble. Another woman found Tolstoy, not banned, but deeply out of favor in a regime that despised Russian literature. War and Peace became her obsession. She read it slowly, savoring the sprawling narrative, the moral complexity, the refusal to reduce war to heroism or villainy. Tolstoy wrote about soldiers as human beings, not symbols. He wrote about the chaos and absurdity of conflict, the randomness of survival, the lies nations tell themselves to justify slaughter. It was everything her training had denied. These women did not discuss what they read, not at first, but they recognized each other, in glances exchanged across the mess hall, in the way certain titles circulated through hidden channels, in the quiet solidarity of those who had begun to see the walls for what they were. They formed no resistance. They issued no declarations. But in the privacy of their own thoughts, between the lines of forbidden books, they began the slow work of dismantling everything they had been taught to believe, and in that silence, louder than any propaganda, the truth took root. April 1945, Camp Crossville. The news arrives on a Tuesday morning, printed in the Nashville banner that sits on the library table. The headline is stark and ambiguous: Berlin falls, Hitler dead, Reich surrenders. Ilse reads it 3 times before the words stop feeling like fiction. She is not alone in the library. 4 other women stand near the shelves, frozen in place. One of them, Anna, begins to cry, not in grief, but in something more complicated: relief, horror, the collapse of certainty. 4 months, they had heard rumors, whispered reports from new arrivals, fragments of information from letters that made it through censorship. The Eastern Front had crumbled. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was encircled. But rumors were easy to dismiss. The Reich had survived the impossible before. Secret weapons were always just weeks away. Victory was always still within reach. Now, the newspaper in front of them declared it finished. Not whispered, not speculated. Printed in black ink on cheap paper, distributed to prisoners of war without ceremony or hesitation. The guard at the door, the same corporal who had nodded at Ilse months earlier, says nothing. He does not gloat. He does not offer commentary. He simply leans against the doorframe, waiting. Ilse picks up the newspaper and walks to the window. Outside, the Tennessee hills roll green and indifferent. Somewhere across the ocean, her city is in ruins. Her family, she does not know. The letter stopped weeks ago. She imagines her mother in the rubble, her younger brother who had been conscripted at 16, her father who had believed until the end. The war is over. Germany has lost, and she is standing in an enemy prison camp, holding an enemy newspaper, and no one is stopping her from reading the truth. She turns back to the shelves. Her eyes scan the titles until they land on one she has avoided until now: The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, an American analysis, written by William Shire, a journalist who had been in Berlin before the war. She had seen the book weeks ago and walked past it, unable to confront what it might contain. Now, she pulls it down. The pages are dense, meticulous, unsparing. Shire writes about the Nuremberg rallies, the Reichstag fire, the Night of the Long Knives. He writes about the camps, not prisoner of war camps like this one, but the other kind. The kind she had heard whispers about, but never confirmed. The kind the regime had kept hidden even from its own people. She reads about Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. The words on the page feel impossible. Industrial, systematic, millions. She wants to close the book, to reject it as propaganda, to insist it cannot be true. But the detail is too specific, the documentation too thorough. Shire cites sources. He includes testimony. He names names. And in the pit of her stomach, beneath the disbelief, something clicks into place. She remembers things she had not allowed herself to remember. The neighbors who disappeared in 1938, the Jewish family on her street, gone one morning without explanation, the rumors about deportations to the east, the vague, uncomfortable sense that questions were dangerous, that certain subjects were never to be spoken aloud. She had told herself it was necessary. Security measures, wartime precautions. She had trusted that the state knew what it was doing, that the cause was just, that the sacrifices were temporary. The book in her hands tells a different story. It tells her she had been complicit, not a perpetrator, but not innocent either. She had worn the uniform. She had transmitted the orders. She had looked away when looking would have demanded action. She was not brave enough to take. She closes the book. Her hands are shaking again, but this time it is not wonder. It is recognition. The ground she thought she stood on has dissolved entirely. Anna approaches, her face still wet. Is it true? She whispers. What they're saying. About the camps. Ilse meets her eyes. She does not answer immediately. She simply holds out the book. Anna takes it. She sits down at the table. She begins to read. The transformation does not happen all at once. It is not a single moment of revelation, but a cascade, a crumbling dot in the days following the news of surrender. The library becomes the most crowded space in the camp. Women who had never entered before now stand in line, waiting for their turn at the newspapers, the books, the maps pinned to the wall showing the final movements of Allied forces into Germany. Some come seeking confirmation, others come seeking denial. All of them come seeking something they can hold on to as the ideology that structured their lives disintegrates. The camp authorities, anticipating this, have prepared. They bring in documentary footage, newsreels from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The images are shown in the mess hall on a white sheet hung against the wall. Attendance is voluntary. Most of the women attend. The footage is silent but brutal. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, Allied soldiers forcing German civilians from nearby towns to witness what had been done in their name. The camera does not look away, neither do the projectionists. Ilse watches from the back row. She does not cry. She feels beyond tears, beyond shock. She feels the weight of complicity settling into her bones like radiation. When the lights come back on, no one speaks. They file out in silence. Some return to the barracks and do not leave 4 days. Others go directly to the library, as if words on a page might offer some framework to process what they have seen. One woman, a devout Nazi until this moment, throws her uniform jacket into the trash. Another begins attending the camp's English lessons, determined to read American newspapers without translation. A third writes a letter to the Red Cross, asking if there is any way to help survivors, if there is anything she can do to make amends. The guards watched this unfold with a mixture of relief and unease. They had been told the program might work, but seeing it happen in real time is different. These women are not defeated. They are awake. And waking is a violent process. Ilsa spends the next week reading everything she can find about the camps. She reads survivor testimonies. She reads legal documents prepared for the upcoming Nuremberg trials. She reads philosophical essays about collective guilt, about the responsibility of ordinary people, extraordinary evil. She finds a passage by Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher she had not known existed, that I am still alive after such things have been done weighs on me as a guilt that cannot be expiated. She copies the sentence into a notebook she has begun keeping. Beneath it, she writes, "I did not know, but I should have known." And that is the same thing. The other women notice her withdrawal. She's quieter now, more distant. She no longer participates in the small talk that fills the barracks in the evenings. She reads. She writes. She sits by the window and stares at the hills. One night, Marguerite sits beside her. "You can't carry all of it," she says quietly. "We were lied to. We were children when it started." Ilsa does not look at her. "We stopped being children. And we kept serving. Then what do we do now?" Ilsa finally turns. Her eyes are hollow but clear. "We remember. We make sure it's written down. We make sure no one can ever say they didn't know what happened. It is not forgiveness. It is not redemption. But it is something, a direction, a purpose carved out of the wreckage. In the following weeks, several women begin writing their own accounts, not confessions, exactly, but reckonings. They write about what they saw, what they ignored, what they believed. They write about the propaganda, the fear, the seduction of belonging to something larger than themselves. They write about how easy it had been to stop asking questions. Some of these accounts will be preserved. Others will be destroyed by their authors, deemed too painful, too incriminating. But the act of writing them matters. It is the beginning of accountability. The American officers collect what they can. They file reports. They note which prisoners show genuine transformation and which still cling to fragments of the old ideology. They prepare recommendations for repatriation for those who will return to Germany and those who will seek to remain. And in the library, the books continue to circulate, passed hand to hand, read in silence, underlined in pencil. The spines crease and soften with used. Freedom, it turns out, is not painless. It demands something in return. It demands the courage to see clearly, even when clarity destroys everything you thought you knew. The women of Camp Crossville are learning this lesson, one page at a time. August 1945. Repatriation. Begins. The war in the Pacific ends with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within weeks, the process of returning prisoners to their homelands accelerates. The camps across America begin to empty. For the women of Camp Crossville, the prospect of going home is complicated by a simple fact. There is no home to return to. Germany is rubble. Berlin is divided into Allied occupation zones. The cities they remember, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, exist only as skeletons. The infrastructure has collapsed. The economy is shattered. Millions are displaced, starving, searching for missing family members in the chaos. And yet, most of them prepare to go back. They pack the few belongings they have accumulated. Some try to take books with them, tucked into suitcases, wrapped in spare clothing. The guards turn a blind eye. Officially, prisoners are not supposed to leave with American materials. Unofficially, the camp commanders understand that these books are tools, seeds being carried back to ground that will need replanting. Ilsa is issued discharge papers and a train ticket to New York, where she will board a transport ship for Bremen. She stands in the camp office, holding the documents, and feels nothing resembling relief. "You don't have to go," the processing officer tells her. He's a lieutenant, young, earnest. Some of the others are applying for asylum. "You could stay, work as a translator, help with reconstruction efforts." She considers this. America has been strange but not unkind. She has learned the language. She has skills the occupying forces will need. She could disappear into this vast country, build a life far from the wreckage of the Reich, but her family is somewhere in that wreckage. Her mother, her brother, if he survived. She cannot stay while they are lost. I have to go back, she says. The lieutenant nods. He stamps her papers. Good luck, he says, and means it. On the day of departure, the women gather in the yard one last time. Some embrace, others exchange addresses, promise to write, though they all know how unlikely it is that letters will reach their destinations in the chaos ahead. A few simply walk away without goodbyes, too exhausted for sentiment. Anna finds Ilse near the gate. She presses a small book into her hands, a pocket edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. For the ship, she says. So you don't forget. Ilse takes it. Forget what? That there's another way to live. They do not embrace. They simply look at each other. To women who entered this place as enemies, and leave it as something else. Not quite friends, not quite allies, but changed. The trucks arrive. The women board. The gates of Camp Crossville open, and they drive through into the world beyond. Germany, 1946 to 1950. The women who returned found a country unrecognizable. The cities were moonscapes. Entire neighborhoods had been erased by bombing campaigns. Survivors lived in basements and makeshift shelters. Food was rationed. The black market thrived. The occupying powers, American, British, French, Soviet, carved the nation into zones, each with its own rules, its own currency, its own vision for what Germany should become. And everywhere, the reckoning. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. The evidence presented there, documents, testimonies, films, left no room for denial. The concentration camps had been real. The final solution had been systematic. The Reich had not merely lost a war, it had committed atrocities on an industrial scale. For those who had spent the final years of the war in American captivity, who had already confronted this truth in the quiet of a Tennessee library, the revelations were confirmation rather than shock. But for millions of other Germans, the trials were the first time the full scope became undeniable. Ilse found her mother in a displaced persons camp outside Hamburg. Her father was dead, killed in an air raid in 1944. Her brother had survived the Eastern Front, but returned broken, silent, unwilling to speak about what he had seen. The family apartment no longer existed. They lived in two rooms, shared with another family, sleeping in shifts, surviving on Red Cross rations, and whatever work they could find. Ilse became a translator for the British occupation authorities. Her English, learned in captivity, made her valuable. She worked in municipal offices, helping process denazification paperwork, translating documents for tribunals that assessed the guilt and complicity of former party members. It was grim work. Every day, she encountered people who claimed ignorance, who insisted they had only followed orders, who swore they had known nothing about the camps. Some were lying, others were not. The line between victim and perpetrator, she discovered, was far less clear than she had once believed. In the evenings, she read. The books she had smuggled back from America were battered now, passed among a small circle of friends who met in secret to discuss what they had learned, what they were learning, what kind of country might be rebuilt from the ashes. These informal reading groups spread across the western zones. Former prisoners of war, returned soldiers, intellectuals who had survived the regime. They gathered in bombed-out apartments and church basements, sharing contraband literature, debating the future. Some of these circles would evolve into political movements. Others would dissolve into disillusionment, but they represented something essential, the fragile beginning of a free intellectual culture in a nation that had tried to extinguish such a thing. The American and British occupation authorities supported these efforts cautiously. They established new libraries. They licensed newspapers and publishing houses. They screened films and organized lectures. The goal was denazification through education. The same principle that had governed the POW camps now applied to an entire population. It was messy. It was incomplete. Many former Nazis slipped through the process, reclaimed positions of power, buried their pasts. The Cold War complicated everything, as both sides prioritized geopolitical loyalty over moral accountability. Justice was uneven, often arbitrary, but something had shifted. The generation that had lived through the war, especially those who had been exposed to alternatives, who had seen what freedom of thought looked like, carried that knowledge forward. They became teachers, journalists, civil servants. They raised children in a different Germany, one that taught history after the mythology, that allowed dissent rather than crushing it. Ilse never forgot the library at Camp Crossville. In 1952, when she became a secondary school teacher, she filled her classroom with books. She encouraged her students to question, to debate, to read widely. When they asked about the war, she did not offer easy answers. She told them what she had learned, that ordinary people could commit extraordinary evil when they stopped thinking for themselves, that patriotism without moral scrutiny was not virtue but danger, that the freedom to read, to think, to disagree was not a luxury but a necessity. Some of her colleagues thought she was too harsh. Others thought she was too lenient. She did not care. She had stood in a prison camp in Tennessee and been given access to the truth. She would not withhold that from the children now in her care. The books had changed her. Now, she would use them to change others. There are many weapons in war. Bombs that level cities, bullets that tear through flesh, propaganda that twists minds into instruments of the state. But there is also this, a book on a shelf, a choice freely given, the quiet, dangerous act of allowing someone to think for themselves. The women who stood in that Tennessee library did not defeat fascism with rifles. They defeated it with pages, with words written by people their government had condemned, with ideas their leaders had tried to burn. They had expected cruelty. They found trust. They had been taught that freedom was chaos. They discovered it was clarity. The simplest tyranny is the one that controls what you are allowed to know. The deepest rebellion is the one that happens inside your own mind. When you realize the walls were never necessary, that the cage was built from lies, and that the door was always unlocked. In a war of bullets and bombs, a library shelf became the most dangerous battlefield of all, not because it destroyed the enemy, but because it revealed that the enemy was never the people on the other side. It was the willingness to stop asking questions, to accept what you were told, to believe that some ideas were too dangerous to encounter. The women who read those books carried them home, and in the ruins of a shattered nation, they planted seeds. Not all of them took root, but some did, and that was enough.